Thank you so much for coming. It's not quite such a bad evening as it was earlier in the week, but it's still not ideal, is it? And what, as a disclaimer, first and foremost, I'm not going to give you many answers of absolutely everything you can do for your post-pandemic child tonight, but put a little bit more context into what we're seeing. Hopefully you'll be honest, really please be open and honest. We are not expecting, if your children are joining us in September, we're not expecting them to be all singing or dancing right now, but actually giving us the heads up of things that you found challenging over the pandemic would be really helpful. And I want to be able to, hence why the lovely old-fashioned flip charts here, because we're going to just jot down some of those thoughts so that we try and cover as much as we can, because it is supposed to be purposeful. So for those of you that I haven't met, and I think I have met most of you, I'm Tracy Chong, head of the Boys Prep, and Ali Gow here is head of pre-prep and currently reception teacher. And at the back there we've got Mr. King and Mrs. Smith next to him, who both, Mr. King is deputy in charge of academics, and Mrs. Smith is, well, everything at the Boys Prep, but she's always at the end of the phone. We've got obviously our admissions and marketing team here as well tonight, so if there is anything that after the event there's something you want to ask, we're all here. All silly questions are catered for. It's absolutely fine. So as all good lessons should, I'm starting, or either start or finish, I'm starting with a book. And I just want to share with you Thomas Roberts. I don't know how old he is, but he doesn't look a lot older than maybe 18, 19. He spent the pandemic teaching online with his brother and sister. And I think it forced him to do some of his own writing. And I actually think, whilst I know we're going to talk about some of the issues that we've noticed in the pandemic, this does put a little bit into context. So bear with me, it will literally take us 5 minutes. So, great realisation. Tell me the one about the virus again, then I'll go to bed. But my boy, you're growing weary, sleepy thoughts about your head. Please, that one's my favourite. I just once more. Take me back to 2020. That's all I'm asking for. Okay, snuggle down, my boy, though I know you know full well the story starts before then, in a world I once would dwell. It was a world of waste and wonder. You might need to see the illustrations. Of poverty and plenty, back before we understood why hindsight's 2020. You see, the people came up with companies to trade across all lands, but they swelled and got much bigger than we ever could have planned. We'd always had our wants, but now it got so quick. You could have anything you dreamed of in a day and with a click. We noticed families had stopped talking. That's not to say they never spoke, but the meaning must have melted and the work-life balance broke. You can see what he's getting at. And the children's eyes grew squarer and every toddler had a phone. They filtered out the imperfections, but amidst the noise, they felt alone. Every day the skies grew thicker till you couldn't see the stars, so we flew in planes to find them, while down below we filled our cars. We'd drive around all day in circles, we'd forgotten how to run. We swapped the grass for tarmac, shrunk the parks till there were none. We filled the sea with plastic because our waste was never capped, until each day when you went fishing, you'd pull them out, already wrapped. And while we drank and smoked and gambled, our leaders taught us why it's best to not upset the lobbies, more convenient to die. But then in 2020, a new virus came our way. The governments reacted, told us all to hide away. But while we were all hidden, amidst fear, and all the while, we dusted off our instincts. We remembered how to smile. We started clapping to say thank you and calling up our mums, and while the car keys gathered dust, we'd look forward to our runs. And with the skies less full of voyagers, the earth began to breathe, and the beaches bore new wildlife that scuttled off into the seas. Some people started dancing, some were singing, some were baking. We'd grown so used to bad news, but there was good news in the making. Old habits became extinct, and they made way for the new. And every act of kindness was given its due. And so when we found the cure, and were allowed to go outside, we all preferred the world we found to the one we'd left behind. But why do you take a virus to bring people back together? Well, sometimes you get sick, my boy, before you start getting better. So lie down and dream of tomorrow and all the things that we can do, and who knows, if you dream hard enough, maybe some of them will come true. We now call it the Great Realisation. And yes, since then, there have been many. But that's the story of how it started and why hindsight's 2020. Quite a nice little wrap-up of where we've ended up, isn't it? And I think, if we're honest, whilst we've all been through quite a tricky period, I'm sure, for you as parents, as well as us as teachers, as well as your children, we have had some positives. And I think one of the things that we were talking about having so many local families, is actually that opportunity to just be walking to school or to scooting to school has just grown, and that is definitely on the increase. And I think, we've all noticed traffic is slightly better now getting to work. It's slightly dropped. I mean, whether that will change, I don't know. The other thing I just wanted to draw your attention to is that music that you heard at the beginning. That was actually written by our composer in residence, Dave Webb. He's an incredible man. If there was anybody who was resilient, he was resilient before the pandemic, but he was hit with his own health issues during the pandemic, very significantly. But he decided he wanted the community to get together, and so he composed a song that all the girls could sing virtually from, it was senior, but all the girls could sing together, and then they put it together as one track. So that was that. And I know on repeat it doesn't quite have the same impact, but quite an amazing thing for us to do as a whole community. So there were opportunities for sure. On the table over here, just because I'm likely to forget that, is our reflections book. Some of you might have received it, but it's a good picture shot of actually what we did during that time. It wasn't all doom and gloom. It was actually quite fun. There was lots of things that we did online to try and get the children as involved as possible, which turned us into CBeebies presenters at the same time, but was definitely a really good opportunity for us to foster that community, which we were obviously lacking when we were at home. So I think first and foremost, obviously, I think that book for me stands out as yes, it wasn't all bad, and it isn't all bad, and some of the things that we're dealing with children now aren't necessarily just about the pandemic, and they're not necessarily all bad either. So I think that is what I'm hoping you will share with us tonight. And I know that's when you're just starting school, that's a big deal, and you don't really want to share the fact that the child still sleeps for 4 hours a day, or, and that's because you were working from home and you needed them to be quiet. Well, hey, we've all done that. We've all done that. Thankfully, I've got 21 and 25-year-old. That definitely wasn't done in my house. There was an article last week in the back of the Financial Times, actually, the weekend one, that was talking about it's not just the child that's impacted by the pandemic. It's actually all of us. But it's all of us and our relationships with our children. So if you were at home and your child should have been at nursery, or if you were at home and your child was in reception all year one, I mean, I think Mrs. Gow will speak for us here, we were total entertaining all day, really. But actually, your child probably was also nagging you, and you were trying to work. And I look at our parent body, and that there's probably 65 to 70% of both our parents work. So actually, they were splitting that. You were probably all in that same position. So your relationship has completely changed with your children, because yes, parents were all 10 years ago were becoming much more discerning about what education looked like and getting involved, which is brilliant. But never have they had such a goldfish moment of being able to see in that bowl about how their child actually learns and appreciate. It's very easy for us to sit outside as parents and think, well, this isn't happening at school. Why is that not? Why isn't he doing that? And why isn't he written? Why isn't his handwriting any good? And actually, we were seeing it for our own eyes. And I think it's that what we need to come out of this with is just that openness and that transparency about, yeah, these were challenges, and this is how we can deal with it. Because let's be honest, they're 4 or 5. They're not 14 or 50, and finding that quite difficult to get back to. So I think that was quite interesting. It was talking about how also the big corporates have had to completely change their philosophy on the whole working from home. Can you imagine 5 years ago your company saying, you know, go and work at home, why don't you? And why don't you get a dog, and then you can walk the dog in the morning and you'll be fine. And you know, it just wouldn't have occurred to us. We would never have had that change so quickly. And the blessing from a school perspective is, if I'm honest, if the DfE turned around and said to us, right, you need to go online and you need to be able to provide a hybrid version of your teaching, it would have taken a 5-year rollout, the unions would have been up in arms, and we would have had training every other week. And we had to do it overnight. And actually, that's been hugely beneficial to us. So the fact that apparently 1 in 12 teachers since September, not here, but nationally, have had COVID, so have been off, in rotation, and we've had that as well here. But the beauty of the fact that the children could be at home, actually totally asymptomatic, but off because of COVID, but still able to log in, that hybrid version of teaching and learning, we would never have had. So there are huge positives. But how do we cope with it moving forward? I think we've got to think that this is probably, we're playing catch up. I mean, I was probably quite naive, if I'm honest. When we came back from lockdown, I was just so relieved to see them all running back through the door with their really enormous smiles on their face and just playing together. And I was probably naive to think, okay, that's great, that's it, it's done. You know, that's amazing. You start to see some impact a little bit further down the line. And sometimes we've seen a little bit of that with reception, but I'm not going to tell you what we've seen, because I'm going to ask you first of all. What do you think now your challenges are, or have you noticed any changes? You might have older siblings that you have gone through, and how you feel your younger one. I mean, quite a lot of that has been around practical things, and that's absolutely fine. If it's practical, sleep or feeding, or those are the things that we're sort of slightly noticing. Has anybody got anything they'd like to share with us about things that they've seen impact, or things that they're interested in, wondering whether we have? I know it takes a while for the first person to ask, but please go for it.
Happy to.
Go for it.
I think there's two things. One, I'm definitely a glass overflowing person that's seen loads of positives off the back of all this. But I do think, I don't know anyone from my nursery, I don't know if they are, but the constant rule changing interpretation of the legislation is like, whatever happens now, the government and or organisations, but probably hopefully not the school, think too little about just switching off a service or closing something down. And we saw that with the storms recently. Hey, stay at home, lockdown again. Right? The wind's blowing. Right? And I think that
it's
for me, that consistency and interpretation or misinterpretation is quite boring once.
And I think
but that's quite clear.
Consistency, I think, is exactly one of the things I want to talk about, because that's exactly it. I mean, who would have stayed at home for a storm? And I was determined. I was in the middle of central London, and I was determined. I was having a day out with my daughter, and we were going to walk. So when the second wheelie bin fell in front of us with Cotswolds going out, okay, it's a bit windy, we'll just have to cope with it. But you're right, we would never have dreamt of that. And so that consistency, I think, is really important. But and the unpredictability is the things that the children struggle with. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what I want to talk about, that just not knowing whether today your mum is your mum or your teacher, or whether actually your mum's not around this morning because she's on a work call and therefore dad's the teacher this morning, or actually you just left to your own devices today. And that sort of unpredictability of those relationships has been, what we're now seeing, has been quite challenging. And I think practically, is there anybody out here who's noticed anything in terms of food? Food has been quite a key thing for us. Have you got a fussy eater? Anyone got a fussy eater? Have you got someone who grazes all day long? What we have noticed coming back is that very, very few of them eat with a knife and fork. Very, very few. They're not really sure what they are for. And they feel like they need to snack all day long. It's like a little snack along, and you can imagine that, because at home by 8:30, if you've had breakfast with them and you've logged them on and you can imagine that by 9 o'clock can I have a smoothie or a rice cake, and they feel that back at school, it's like, when's the snack? When's that happening? And it has been that constant thing. So that was one of the practical things. But what we have found coming in, and it wasn't so obvious last year's reception, if I'm honest. This year's reception came in having had a very patchy start at preschool life. So they perhaps had gone to nursery, but there was days off, there was weeks off, they were splitting groups, they were bubbling. It wasn't nursery as they had thought it would be. So things like a routine or understanding the rules or knowing that actually you can't go and punch Freddie when he isn't sharing a toy with you, all of that kind of went slightly awry because they weren't quite used to having to do that en masse. They were actually quite often at home with you, getting quite focused time and focused attention, which has so many pluses and so many benefits, but also then sees a readjustment for coming into school. Anybody got anything before I?
I've probably got two. Boundaries,
Yes.
I think, have disappeared, as you kind of said. It's,
Yeah.
am I 100% focused on you and able to kind of make sure you eat your food properly, you use a knife and fork, etc., or is it, I've got to work in 5 minutes, just eat what the hell you can, and I'll stick the TV on and I'll
Don't
be
touch
over
the
here.
cooker.
Yeah, I mean, so kind of when I'm in parent mode versus work mode versus whatever mode, I think boundaries just disappeared, and it became really hard to do that, and you spend a lot of time on your phone in front of them because you were probably checking your emails and working and everything else, and whereas you want to be 100% focused on them, the reality of doing that disappeared.
Yeah.
The other one I'd say is socialisation.
Yeah.
I think kind of
We all have, haven't we?
just that core period I think you've got for them, especially kind of from the age of probably 18 months onwards, when normally they would be creating all those social bonds and everything else, kind of disappeared.
Yeah.
And you had nearly a year or kind of plus when somebody coming into your house was weird.
Yeah.
So kind of how they get, I mean, and I know they bounce back really quick, but I still think there's some latent
There definitely is.
misunderstanding of just how to build relationships and kind of what that looks like.
And has anyone else seen that within family life? That, actually seeing grandparents, they didn't see the grandparents. If you had grandparents abroad, we've got families who are now wanting a little bit of time off school because they've not seen their grandparents for 2 years. Or those relationships that were quite dear to them have been slightly eroded, and so it's trying to build those back and back to, I hated us talking about going back to normal, what's normal, because actually apparently it takes something like 88 days to come out of to be institutionalised. And well, if it takes 88 days, we're all institutionalised into what's happened to us since COVID. So I think one of the things that we've worked quite hard on in terms of class situation is just making sure that we give them that time just to be. Some of them were absolutely on it, and it really worked for them to be online learning and have the focus and just the one-to-one, and they had a parent or somebody with them, and therefore it was great. Others had a completely different view, and everything was open, so we all saw that. We all saw what the lounge looked like or the dining room looked like when there was somebody running in and out. I mean, those, even the BBC presenters had those issues, but it opened a window to our life that we would never normally share with each other. And you saw us at our probably, please don't shout out again for the 44th time in this online lesson, because it's really irritating, but there were times when that was a challenge. So I think that from a relationship point of view was quite unique and quite different, and we're sort of getting back onto, hold on, we want to be transparent with you in a relationship that we're all in it together now, working together for your children. So I think there's been quite a lot of changes. The good news is your children are pretty amazing. I think John Coles, who's our director of United Learning, stood up not very long ago on one of our first meetings back, and he had broken his Achilles in the middle of online, and it was a long recovery. So he was saying, well, for me, it's been a massive positive because I've been at home with my broken Achilles. So he was trying to sort of get everyone into the sort of positive mood. Because we're academies and independents in United Learning, there were different challenges for us. So you'd have 12 heads in a room and there'd be some saying, well, my children don't have devices, so actually how can I do online learning with them? And I think there was a stark difference about the approach, and I'll come on to that a little bit later. But one of the things that he said, and I thought it was quite poignant, is, our children have done national service for us actually, because they weren't really impacted a lot. Most of them, if they probably have had it and we didn't test them, we didn't know that they've had it, but they would have been largely asymptomatic. And they kind of have put life on pause a little bit. And so we absolutely owe them, but we owed them anyway. So actually, is it just about that great part in Great Realisation there, about actually just taking that time to step back, reflect, and look at those individuals in that tailored approach where you can see who's absolutely ready. I mean, Mrs. Gow was saying probably a month ago, oh my goodness, the children, they're not wanting to write, they're not really keen, and now look, they're now writing because they've just been exposed to such rich language that actually they've taken that on really quickly and it's all taken off, and that's about our impatience, which I'm also going to come on to. I do think the media has been hugely to blame for some of these throwaway statements about how much our children have dropped back, and they've done one tiny little study, somewhere in the middle of the country where one school has had no contact with their parents and children, and they've gone to rack and ruin overnight, and I feel like we were exposed in a way that we've never been exposed before. And I think some children have had bad experiences. There's no two ways about it. We can't pretend for a minute that they haven't. But actually, when you look around, they are much less than the media would let us believe. And there was a statement, so the Education Endowment Foundation do lots of quantitative data. They love their quantitative churning out of information. 20% of people do this and 10% do this. And they did some work on how, and you've probably read it because it went into top line news, how we're 7 months behind, our children on starting school are 7 months behind in any socialisation and 12 months behind in reading, and their spelling's atrocious, and actually it was just a whole kind of jump on the bandwagon of where we've dropped, and nationally and probably globally, to be honest. But they were doing that. So one of the things that they talk about is that their communication and language has dropped 18% on entry. I don't quite know how they're measuring that, but aside from that, there was a programme that rolled out across the nation in 2008 called Every Child a Talker. And that was in response to the fact that we felt that children on entry to reception were talking less, but we're blaming it on the pandemic. And that was only just last year. That was in 2008. So Every Child a Talker was spread out across the nation. Every Child a Reader was spread out across the nation. Michael Rosen was behind that. There was lots of assessing as we went about how they were communicating. So it's not a new thing. It's absolutely been around for a while, but we have kind of lumped it all together, and that's the fault of the pandemic. That's the issue since the pandemic. And what we found in terms of reading, it's about engagement, and actually some of the children spent quite a lot of time at home reading, so they're actually pretty amazing at reading. Of course there'll be a pocket of children that just didn't have that opportunity, but actually on the whole, probably 80% of your children did have that opportunity, and if they didn't, they'll soon catch up when they're back at school. And I think it's about that impatience about it catching up right now that we're worrying about. And that, that whole thing, I don't know if anybody's read this book by Johann Hari. It's not for children, he was just on the radio a couple of weeks ago, so you may well have heard him. He was interviewed. He talks a lot about how impatient we are as adults, how impatient we are these days, and how you I was thinking that so shows my age, but now we click and we expect to see that film, and actually we're irritated if that wheel of doom is going around while we're waiting for that film. Well, rewind 20 years, we'd be walking down the road to Blockbuster Videos to pick up a film that the person before us hadn't bought back, so we might have to wait till tomorrow. And actually, that was normal. That was absolutely normal. We've become so impatient as a nation, but as a nation of adults. And, you know, we can pretend that we're great at putting leaving our devices downstairs, or they all go in the basket at 8 o'clock, and, you know, but in reality, is that really what's happening? We have, as a nation, become impatient. We want things very quickly. I think the most telling, as I open the book, and I have only read one chapter in the middle that I was really interested in, but the most telling thing is the titles of his chapters. The increase in speed, switching and filtering, the crippling of our flow states, the rise of physical and mental exhaustion, the collapse of sustained reading, the rise of ADHD and how we're responding to it, and the confinement of our children both physically and psychologically. I mean, that, you know, it doesn't make for exciting reading, but it's really interesting. And some of it goes way back. It goes way, way before the pandemic. It's all about the digital world and how we've adapted and changed, but it's handy to blame it on something that's not really been of our making, or that we've not voluntarily gone into. It's much more handy, isn't it? And I think one of the things he talks about, and I think it's really interesting in terms of, you've heard that you'll see lots more people talking about ASD diagnosis or ADHD diagnosis, and how, you know, that didn't happen when I was at school. How come there's so many more people that have got diagnosis? Is it because we're diagnosing more? Is it because we're noticing more? Actually, that's not the important thing. The important thing is that we're recognising what a child needs to move to that next stage of progress, or that next stage of development. He talks, there's a lovely bit in, and this was all about ADHD and this rise of people going out for medication and wanting a diagnosis because they want medication. And that's actually gone now. That was a good sort of 10 years ago, really, that thought. But he talks about how we've dealt with that, and I think it's quite an interesting point. He's talking about why don't we just give medication? He said, he looked somber and said, there's the old metaphor that villagers are at the river one day and they notice a dead body come floating down the river. So they do the right thing. They take it out and they give it an appropriate burial. The next day, 2 bodies come down the river and they do the appropriate thing and they bury the bodies. This goes on for a while. And finally, they start to wonder where those bodies are coming from down the river. And if we should actually do something to stop that. So they go up the river to find out. And I think that's where we're at. Let's go up the river to find out what the impact is. Let's look a little bit deeper at what perhaps, and let's not blame it all on the last 2 years. We definitely, I do think, have got a bit of work to do. I don't want to sound flippant at all, and I don't want to judge, but I have always been a big state believer. My first teaching post was in state. I've moderated across the borough for early years for a long time, and I have been a staunch supporter. What I saw as an enormous change, an enormous difference over the pandemic, was that thing you were talking about, that relationship building just was not there. It was broken. And partly it was broken because the minute we went into lockdown, and yes, there were schools that didn't have devices, so they couldn't contact, but the unions were so vociferous about, no, you cannot contact this is not what you're doing for your children, you should be contacting them via this device, on this time, at this point. Some children were having 15 minutes a week contact with their school. Like, what are you going to learn in 15 minutes a week? So I don't want to say because some of the state schools, I'm sure, did a pretty good job, but I know even locally, and our local state schools are brilliant, but actually there was that challenge. And potentially it was the challenge of, well, 2 people in my class haven't got devices, so I definitely can't do it for all 30, so I won't do it at all. And I'm not saying that was the teachers making that decision, that was coming from above, and we were able to make our own decisions. And I think that was a huge blessing for us. We have had to put in, and United Learning are always asking us, which is a good thing, always asking us, where's the points at which you've seen skills drop, or what have you seen drop? And in fact, we were talking today just with another of our United Learning schools about, well, actually, knowledge and skills haven't decreased. We assessed the boys when they came back, and they were exactly, where we would have hoped them to be. One of the areas was probably stamina in writing that we're looking at, and that was probably because in terms of us teaching those lessons, where you would normally teach a writing piece and be knocking on someone's shoulder going, I just want another line there, or let's have a look at how I've scaffolded that, or let me just show you how I model that. That couldn't take place quite so easily in the class situation. So what we were ending up doing within that classroom situation was a much more punchy 5-minute starter, or a 10-minute execution of if you hadn't written more than 3 lines in 10 minutes, you might not have another 15 minutes to write it up, whereas you would at school. So we're seeing that a little bit, less so in our Key Stage 2. The recovery programme that we had to put together most was definitely with this current reception. And there were different challenges. Now, a lot of that could be to do with the fact that they're just quite a different cohort, and sometimes you just get a group of children who are a different cohort. I mean, we've got 4 children that have come from one nursery who have been very used to being quite loud, quite leery and quite aggressive in their play, and we've had to re-teach them about actually this is not how we play, this is not what we do. But gently, because that was a bit alien to them. So the recovery programme that we about week 3 after we'd first got them in, we kind of went, okay, what do we need to look at? What are we seeing? And so communication language was one of them, and it was very much around the vocabulary of the tier groups, which you might have heard me talk about before. They knew all the tier 1 vocabulary, which was milk please, water please, bed, bike, knew all of the kind of needs vocabulary. And they also were quite well briefed in the tier 3 vocabulary, which is all the domain specific stuff, like you'd been at home with them, you thought, right, well, I will teach them all about dinosaurs today because I'm back at home, so they knew all the dinosaurs, or they knew all the steam trains, or, they were incredible facts and domain specific knowledge that perhaps you'd imparted on them, or they'd had that imparted on them. The tier 2 vocabulary was the thing that we were looking at. So that vocabulary where they're questioning, they're reasoning, they're thinking critically, and they're taking responsibility for their own learning. So actually I really liked that, so I want to do a bit more of that. And what we do in reception is make sure that those opportunities to use everything from a concrete point of view, so you've got the resources on hand, and you don't have that at home. Let's be honest, when have you got 10 Unifix cubes and a Dean's block and an abacus? You haven't got those things to just grab. And that's what we've wanted to teach them, is just having that opportunity to go out, get those things, be responsible for their learning, and take a bit of ownership for that. And I think that's what we're seeing now at this point. We're halfway in the year. They're amazing. They're absolutely incredible. And they're my kind of flagship, looking at, wow, look how far you've come in just such a short time. Parents were dropping off having not really seen the school probably, having not really understood where their children were going to be, who the teacher was, what they were going to do, and they've trusted. And I have to say, we're at this point in the year and we feel like, actually, do you know what, they're there. And now Mrs. Gow is not going grey any longer. That was definitely the point, wasn't it? And then there was a point where we were like, oh, okay, it's the socialisation thing was really absolutely that. Because when they had been together, they just went for it. And that was that kind of, oh yeah, I just want to play with you and grab you and you're the one. And you can understand that. They just didn't want to let them go. And it was a bit like us when we were allowed out for the first time. So what, we're going on a night out? Really? Like, how do we do that? And then we all realised it was such a trial to go out and book a table and have to get out of your place for an hour and a half. We didn't do it anymore. And I think there's definitely some hard and fast lessons to be learned in terms of that understanding that things take a bit longer and things might take a little bit more time. We're really happy where reception are now. I'm delighted with where Year 1 are, and now they will also hit in a very similar way. They had got to the point where actually they were quite mature in their socialising, so they just hit the ground running when they came back, and that's absolutely what we found with Usually we expect in the Christmas holidays and then at Easter they sort of dip back a little bit, but what we're finding reception doing now is moving at a great speed and moving at a great pace because they're eager to do it. So the foundations are back there. And I think as a parent, the panic I have from some parents going, my child's not even out of nappies, what am I going to do? Well, that's okay. Actually, there's so much happens between that July or, when you're last at nursery and then they arrive with us in September. There's so much, and you do hand over a toddler to us, and actually they don't look like a toddler for much longer. They really don't. And I know it's such a big thing when you first hand over your firstborn, particularly, second and third maybe not quite so worried about. But firstborn in particular is such a wrench. I know it's such it's a real heart thing. But we're certainly sensing that they want to be there, they want to learn, they've missed the socialisation. So being together and running riot is amazing when they're allowed to do that, and then it's amazing when they're back in the classroom. And I think every year group we've seen a little bit of a tweak and a need to look at that socialisation all over again. One of our United Learning, the head, the lead of the United Learning group came in yesterday, and he happened upon a playtime with Year 5 boys. He said, I've never seen so much rolling around on the ground. I was like, oh gosh, And there's a point where you say, okay, do we go really heavy and say, right, stay on your feet and you shouldn't be touching each other? Or actually, do you say, we trust you, we give you responsibility, you know when you step out of line that it becomes more than just playing, that's a problem. And giving them that responsibility to do that is so much better. I mean, that's what we do that even down in reception. It's giving them the scaffolding to understand, well, what happens if we don't do the right thing by our friend, so that it becomes much more natural. And clearly at Year 5 they've got complete control over that because that's what they felt like doing when he was there. One of the last things I want to say before I open up to questions is you might have read this week about this new thing on the media called the ghosted child. And this is all about, since coming back to school, children have played truant more, children have pretended, feigned illness before, parents have become much softer about, you've got a bit of a sniffly nose, you don't need to go to school today. And I think, to your point about the rules and the regulations, that has messed with everybody's mind as to, how long do we have off? Do we do, 10 days? Do we do 5 days? What is the thing? And we are all driven by rules. We all want to know exactly what there is. And when those rules are disrupted and you become unpredictable and you don't have that routine, I do think it becomes quite challenging. And one of the things that the older boys certainly talk about, and I have had this slight ghosted child is nonsense. It gives you 7 steps about how you can try to help your child and what we need to do. And the 7th one is build better relationships. Well, that's key. That's just straight across the board for everyone, every child that ever walked the land, not post-pandemic. That's key to all of our development and learning, and that bespoke, tailored approach is what is important. And for you as parents, it's about not expecting from what you've experienced, not expecting, oh my goodness, I need to send them reading, they need to be writing their name by the time they get to school. No, they don't actually, but that relationship building, that vocabulary, that talking to them is where they've missed out a little bit, because we've all had other jobs to do as well at the same time. One of the boys in Year 6, who, bear in mind, our Year 6s have just heard about their senior schools, so whilst you're thinking about your starting, they're thinking about the other end, and they've all sort of got their results coming through, and I had been asked in an interview what keeps me awake at night, and I thought that's really interesting. I'm not really sure what keeps me awake at night. It's different on different nights, I think. So I asked one of the boys in preparation for one of his interviews, what keeps you awake at night? And he said, well, sometimes I worry about what school I might be going to. So, and I totally understand that. You've sat 5 schools, you want to know where you're going. I totally get that. And he said, and the other thing that I worry about sometimes is the news. And I thought about it afterwards, and we went back and talked about it again. And I thought, yeah, actually, all of our children have been exposed to way more media and news than they ever would have been. So if you think about 10-year-olds talking about fishing rights, Brexit, Trump, it was I mean, don't get me wrong, we've had some amazing conversations, but they have been exposed to some of the things politically, from a government point of view, that we probably never would have had as children. I don't know that I probably knew who the Prime Minister was at 10, but I don't think there would have been much discussion. But there has been, because they've been around, those discussions taking place. And I think that is I want to work particularly with that age range now, about that's okay, that how they presented that news as well. You know, lots of that news was through social media, not necessarily our boys' social media, but social media coming in on the phones. I mean, how many of us looked every day at what those statistics were? We did. We all did. For a while, it was an obsession. And I think they have seen that fear factor that comes through on social media, because that's the very nature of it. And that's how they're feeding back their news. And so opinions about Brexit and Trump were quite vivid when they came back. So I think that is another thing that is one of the things that we just need to ease them back gently into it now. And one of the ways that we've done that at school is just throw them into real language-rich texts and books that are exciting, and books that are really going to take them on an imaginative journey, rather than anything that's too fact-based. They're full of that. They've got amazing facts themselves, amazing knowledge acquisition. But I think that ability to sell yourself back into that imagination and that creative world, which is what we do a lot of in reception in year one, is important all the way through. So, I think my parting words are that your children will be fine. I think the minute we, let's be honest, the minute we have children, the minute we give birth, we feel guilty for every last thing we do. Whether we feed them, whether we don't, whether we sleep train them, whether we don't, whether we send them to nursery, whether they have a nanny, all of those things are there as a guilt trap for us all. And I think what we have to do is give ourselves a break. I think you have to say, well, do you know what, that was a period in time. And actually I can't necessarily go back and make up for those. You know, one of the things that you've just touched on there about the not doing the things as a toddler, you know, I was watching one of our children doing an assault course, and he put, honestly, tiny bricks like this out on the playground, and he was all over the place, bless him. And I thought, yeah, actually, you would have probably been to soft play once a week last year, but you've not been into a soft play probably ever, or since you were 1.5 when you don't remember it. All of those things, that the musical monkeys or movement or swimming, they just didn't have it. So all of that core thing is about building that back up as well. So I think from your perspective, you need to give yourselves a break. I think all of the things we've talked about today are happening for all of us. I think every single one of us has been impacted in a different way. One of the things that we've realised as a staff, and I think as a community, is we've all been impacted so differently, that actually being kind to each other is really important, and be actually looking out for each other. And that has really strengthened our community base for sure. And for the children as well, understanding they were absolutely so ecstatic to come back to school, and I think that just says it all. You just see them running through, and actually all the cares of the world are gone as far as they're concerned. So, and I think that is important that we keep that going. At that point, is there anything that you'd like to ask? Because I've non-stop talked at you, sorry. It's hard once I get going to stop. Anything that is a concern, and anything that's not about post-pandemic that you're worried about, or that you wonder how we're going to deal with it, or at what pace. Look, witness this. This is a very contented parent body here. They've got no concerns, they're going to be happy, it's just fine. I think the important thing is that you stay in touch, and we have that relationship that we've missed so much when we were doing our online learning, that you are in touch with us, transparent with us about challenges that you think you might have, anything with starting at school. And if you're not coming to us and you're just here for the fun of it tonight, just bear that in mind, wherever you are going to, whether it's a nursery or a school, that actually that open relationship is really important, and you shouldn't be suffering. I spoke to a parent today who's been having 18 months of her son anxious at night going to sleep, and she hasn't shared it with us. And in school in the day, he's a dream, and we would not have known. But actually, she's tearing her hair out because she thinks he's not happy. And at school, he looks like he loves life. So it's about keeping that relationship open. Well, why is she worried about it for 18 months? No, you shouldn't be worrying about that for longer than a few days. That's about getting on top of that, because I know we all worry about our own children in different ways. So I can stand here and I'll sound all relaxed about it, but I did exactly the same with my own two. So I would have worried about every last move. Is there anything else? Please do feel free.
I was going to wait see if anyone else has something. But so I actually overheard someone talking about this as well. Is it 2 cohorts? Is there two
classes?
2 classes.
Yeah.
So my second subsequent question then is that so my son, he has 2 or 3 from his nursery that are coming here.
Okay.
They didn't do a very good job of telling us that they were
Okay.
doing that, so we found out through socialising ourselves, frankly. How do you group them in that way, or does that not factor? So if they all came from, I don't know, nursery A down the road, would you try and do
So
it?
it's a good question.
Because he talks about it a lot, that Alec is coming, Alexander's coming. And
So we work really, both classes are very much part of the same, you know, in the afternoon they're very much together in lots of their activities. They're seen as a year group who own the floor, basically. But we will take advice on both of that. So we have a handover from the nursery, and it might well be that actually, so the 4 boys I was talking about from the nursery that absolutely adore each other, quite right, they should be together. They absolutely adore each other, and it was just the point of us working out how that worked. But we do get some nurseries who'll say, do you know what, those 2 boys or that girl and that boy just, it doesn't really work. It might be better. And we would expect you to say the same if you felt really strongly that actually it's not been a good impact. And you know, some children just have really magnetic relationships and they just absolutely obsess about one person in particular. And if you think that's going to be a negative coming in, we'll very happily take, I don't have any hard and fast view on how we split them. Some like the comfort of having their mate from nursery, and I think that's quite important sometimes. And Mrs. Gow talks to them and actually visits when she can, so this year will be fine about visiting, and sees them in action really. So we'll take your lead and the nursery's lead on that.
No, that's sensible. And how big are the classes, do you know? Do you have an idea now?
So I don't, not for sure, because we're in our first phase of that new registration year group. We're still a little bit unsure, but we're probably looking at 14 and 14. We're max 18 and 18 really, but I'm thinking it's probably likely to be 14 and 14. This year we've grown actually a couple, haven't we?
13 and 14.
But we're 13 and 14 now.
Just a question just to build on that point about them starting together or not. Do you mix the classes later? Because it's quite common for girls' school. They just keep us on our toes.
Keep you on your toes.
So do you do that as well here?
So after COVID, bear in mind I started in the January, we went into lockdown in the March, and I was like, what do you mean you swap classes every year? I only did it once in my last school and it was a headache, it was a nightmare, I had post-it notes all over the floor. I was thinking, really? You do that for every year group? So we had a bit of a rain check about that during COVID. And we have talked about doing a end of year 2, because by that time they've had reception year 1, year 2. You pretty much know who works well together and who doesn't at that point. And then potentially again at year 4. And interestingly, this year we didn't swap year 2 because they hadn't had any time together at all. So we will take a call on that, but we're certainly not going back to do that yearly. I feel quite strongly that some children take a little bit longer to build a relationship, and if they've just built a relationship with a group of friends and it takes them, you know, perhaps till Christmas to build that, to take them away from them then again in July is quite a big deal. So I think it's quite important that you allow that relationship to build, but there are definitely times when you do know, okay, there's time for those to split, or they don't work well together. They might be great mates, but they don't work well together. So that's our intention, and but as I say, it doesn't definitely always happen, and it won't happen more than that. Look at that absolute silence. Thank you so much. we would really welcome you to stay and have a glass of wine and chat to each other. You might be in the same class as each other next year, you never know. But if there is anyone, there are lots of us around. If you want to ask any questions that are personal to you, please do feel free. And thank you so much again for coming out on a night which wasn't the most attractive night to come out on. We'll try a summer one night.